This house is too big for one old woman to rattle around in. My son-in-law said it the way men say things they've been rehearsing in the car on the way over. Confident, reasonable, as if he were delivering a kindness and not a verdict. He was standing in my kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee I had made for him, and he didn't even set it down when he said it, just kept drinking. My daughter sat at the table beside him, turning a paper napkin over and over in her hands, not looking at me. I remember the exact quality of the light that afternoon. February light, thin and pale, coming through the window above the sink where I had washed dishes for 31 years. The window my husband had installed himself the summer before our daughter was born. Measuring twice, cutting once, the way he did everything, carefully, with intention. I stood at the counter, and I did not respond right away. I had learned long ago that some words deserve a moment of silence before you answer them. Not because you don't know what to say, but because you want to be sure you mean what you say when you say it. I'm too old to live alone here, I repeated quietly. My son-in-law had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, but only slightly. My daughter still wouldn't meet my eyes. That was how it began. Not with cruelty, exactly. That's what makes these things so difficult to name. It began with concern, or at least the shape of it. My name is Dorothy. I am 68 years old. I taught high school English for 34 years in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio, where I still live in the house my husband Raymond and I bought the year after we married. It is not a grand house. It has 3 bedrooms, a porch that sags slightly on the left side no matter how many times Raymond fixed it, and a backyard with a vegetable garden I have kept going for 2 decades. Raymond died 7 years ago. Heart attack, quick. No warning. One morning he was here, and by noon he was gone. And I have been alone in this house ever since. I am not fragile. I want to be clear about that. I drive myself to the grocery store, and to my doctor's appointments, and to the book club I have attended every 3rd Thursday for 12 years. I shovel my own walk in winter, though my neighbor's teenage son offers every time. I cook real meals, not because I have to, but because I enjoy it. I am not a woman waiting to be managed. I am a woman living her life. But my daughter Sandra had a different story she was telling herself, and her husband Derek was more than happy to help her tell it. Sandra moved back to Columbus 2 years ago. She and Derek had spent the first decade of their marriage in Phoenix, where Derek worked in commercial real estate and Sandra managed a dental office. When Derek's company restructured and his position dissolved, they decided, as Sandra put it, to come back to their roots. Their roots being my house, my town, my proximity. I was glad to have her closer. Sandra is my only child, and after Raymond died, the house had a kind of silence that took some getting used to. Not the comfortable kind of silence you find when you live alone by choice, but the particular silence of a place that used to hold 2 people and now holds 1. I will not pretend I didn't welcome the sound of her voice on the phone more often. I will not pretend I didn't feel something loosen in my chest the day she told me they were moving back. They found an apartment first. It lasted 4 months. The rent, Derek explained, was unreasonable for the space. The commute to his new job was inconvenient. Sandra mentioned, almost in passing, that the guest bedroom at my house had been sitting empty for years. She said it the way you'd mention a window left open during rain, like it was simply a practical observation. Just until we get back on our feet, she said. It won't be long. I said yes the way mothers say yes. Without enough questions. The first months were fine, better than fine some days. Sandra cooked dinner on Tuesday nights. Derek fixed the sagging porch step without being asked, which I appreciated. My grandchildren weren't in the picture yet, but Sandra talked about them like they were coming, and I thought about that with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. There was noise in the house again. There were voices in the hallway, footsteps on the stairs. Raymond had loved the quiet. I had grown into it. But this kind of noise, I thought, this I could make room for. I should have paid closer attention to when the language shifted. It started small. Derek began referring to the backyard as our yard, not my yard, not Dorothy's yard, just ours, like it was a shared thing that had always been that way. Sandra rearranged the pantry one afternoon while I was at book club. She was proud of it when I got home, smiling, pointing out the new system she'd created with labeled bins she'd bought at the Container Store. I stood in the doorway and I looked at my pantry, which I had organized the same way for 20 years, and I said, very calmly, that I would have appreciated being asked. Sandra's smile flickered. Oh, Mom, I was just trying to help. That word, help. It can carry so much inside it without showing any of the weight. By the second year, Derek had developed opinions about the house, the way people develop opinions about things they believe belong to them. He thought the living room furniture was dated. He mentioned it twice before Sandra started mentioning it too. He thought the vegetable garden was taking up space that could be used more efficiently. I want to be honest about something. I did not say enough. I let things go the way women of a certain age are taught to let things go. Quietly, without making anyone uncomfortable, without being the source of trouble. I watched my pantry become their pantry. I watched my living room become the room where Derek watched his programs in the evening. I watched the calendar on the refrigerator fill with their appointments, their obligations, their lives laid out across the weeks in Derek's careful handwriting, and I told myself this was what family looked like. This was closeness. This was not loss, but the garden conversation was different. That one stayed with me. It was last spring, a Saturday morning in May, and I was out back turning the soil in the raised bed Raymond had built the year before he died. My hands were dirty, and my back ached pleasantly the way it does after useful work. Derek came out with his coffee and stood at the edge of the patio, watching me. He had that look he gets, the one where he's decided something and is waiting for the right moment to say it. You know, Mom, he started. Sandra and I have been talking. I kept working the soil. About what? About the property. About the space out here. This plot could be converted into a patio extension. Add some outdoor furniture, a fire pit, maybe. It would add real value. I looked up at him. Real value. Resale value, he said. If you ever decided to sell, I pressed my trowel into the earth and kept my voice even. I'm not planning to sell, Derek. He shifted his weight. Well, we're just thinking ahead. This is a big property for one person to maintain. And with the market the way it is right now, a place like this, in this neighborhood, a comfortable return. He was standing in my husband's backyard, discussing my husband's garden, and talking to me about return on investment. I told him I would think about it. I wouldn't, but I told him I would because the alternative was saying what I was actually thinking, and I was not ready for that conversation yet. I should have been ready sooner. I noticed the pamphlets about 3 weeks after that conversation. They were on the kitchen counter, fanned out like someone wanted them to be seen but couldn't quite commit to leaving them somewhere more obvious. Brochures for 3 different senior communities. All of them with photographs of silver-haired women doing yoga and playing cards and eating salads in bright, sunlit dining rooms. All of them with names that contained words like village and crossing and meadow, as if calling something a meadow could make you forget you hadn't chosen to go there. I picked one up. I read it. I set it back down exactly as I had found it. That evening, Sandra came into the kitchen while I was washing up after dinner. She had the look she'd had as a teenager, when she wanted something she knew I might not give her. A careful, practiced casualness. Mom, she said, sitting down at the table. Derek and I have been doing some research. I know, I said. I saw the brochures. She blinked. Oh, I wanted to talk to you about them properly, not just leave them out. Then why did you leave them out? She pressed her lips together. We're just concerned. You're here alone. and the house is a lot to manage. And we thought. You thought I needed to be managed too, I said. That's not fair, Sandra said. Her voice had an edge now. We're trying to think about your future. My future, I said, is in this house. She exhaled through her nose. Mom, this house is too big for one person. And there it was again. That sentence, back in my kitchen, wearing my daughter's voice this time instead of her husband's. Too big. As if the size of a place you loved could be reduced to square footage, and square footage to inconvenience, and inconvenience to a reason to send you somewhere with a dining hall and a scheduled bus to the pharmacy. I did not raise my voice. I had 34 years of practice keeping my voice level while saying difficult things. You learn that in a classroom. You learn that the authority isn't in the volume. I told her we would talk about it another time. Then I dried my hands on the dish towel, hung it on the oven handle, and went to my room. I didn't sleep much that night. The week after the brochure conversation, I started paying attention in a different way. Not suspicion, exactly. More like the sharp awareness that comes when you realize you have been half asleep and something has changed while you weren't watching. I noticed how often Derek walked through the house, making observations that weren't quite questions. This ceiling could use updating. Those windows are original, aren't they? Have you had the electrical inspected recently? The way he spoke about the house, it had the cadence of assessment, of inventory. I noticed how Sandra deferred to him in those moments. Not reluctantly, but fully. The way you defer to someone whose opinion you've already accepted. I noticed that my sewing room, the small room off the hallway, where I kept Raymond's chair and my fabric, and the quilt I'd been working on for 2 years, had begun to collect their things. A box of Derek's files in the corner. Sandra's off-season clothing hung on my spare rod. Not enough to be called a takeover, just enough to be called a gradual. And I noticed that when Derek spoke to me about the house, he no longer framed it as a question. He framed it as a plan. We're going to look into the window replacement. We've been thinking about opening up the kitchen. We should really have someone assess the foundation. We, as if the deed had his name on it. It did not. The moment everything became clear to me was a Thursday evening in late October. Sandra and Derek were out. I had eaten my dinner alone, which I didn't mind, and I was in the sewing room finishing a hem when I heard Derek's laptop chime from the bedroom. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that. I was not snooping. I was passing the doorway to ask Sandra something, and I stopped because the screen was open and the email was visible, and I read it before I fully understood what I was reading. It was from a real estate agent, a woman whose name I didn't recognize. It was addressed to Derek, and the subject line said simply, Revised Market Analysis, Millbrook Ave Property. My address, my street. I stood in the doorway and I read it. I am not going to pretend I didn't read it. It contained a note about timing, something about waiting until spring for optimal listing conditions. It contained a line that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Once the current occupant situation is resolved, we can move forward with staging. Current occupant. I was the current occupant. In my own home. In the house I had lived in for 31 years. In the house where I had raised my daughter. Where I had nursed my husband through his last year. Where I had taught myself to live alone and found that I could do it with grace. I was the situation to be resolved. I closed the bedroom door carefully. I walked back to my sewing room, and I sat down in Raymond's chair. My hands were very still in my lap. The quilt was in my lap, and I held it without sewing. For a long time, I simply sat with what I now knew. There is a particular kind of grief that comes when a person you love reveals that they have been lying to you not with words but with their whole framing of reality. Sandra had not said a single false sentence to me. She had talked about concern and practicality and the future, but underneath all of it, behind the brochures and the observations and the we language, there had been a plan forming that had nothing to do with my well-being and everything to do with what my house could be worth without me in it. I didn't confront them that night. I have never been a woman who acts from emotion when patience will serve better. Raymond used to say that about me, half admiring and half amused. You think 3 moves ahead. Like a chess player who never tells you she plays chess. That night, I sat in Raymond's chair and I thought. And what I thought was this. They believed that because I was 68 and widowed and had never, not once in 2 years, raised my voice or drawn a hard line, they believed that I would not fight. They mistook gentleness for permission. They mistook my love for my daughter as a form of helplessness. They did not know me well enough. I called my attorney the next morning. Her name is Judith, and she has handled my legal affairs for 15 years. I told her what I had seen. I told her what I had heard over the past 2 years. I told her what I wanted to do. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, with the efficiency I had always appreciated in her, I think we should update the will, and I think we should do it this week. I said, I think so too. We met on a Monday. Judith had the documents ready. We went through everything carefully, the way she had taught me to approach these things, without hurrying, without leaving gaps. By the time I left her office, the house was protected in ways it had not been before, and my estate was arranged in a manner that would make certain realities very clear to anyone who assumed otherwise. I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not triumph, something quieter. The feeling of a woman who has finally stopped making herself smaller and taken up exactly the space she was always entitled to. Sandra and Derek were both home when I got back. They were in the kitchen. Derek on his phone. Sandra making tea. They looked up when I came in. Good morning, I said, as if nothing had changed. But something had. I gave it a few days. I needed to be sure, not about what I had decided, but about how I would say it. The words mattered. They had always mattered to me. 34 years of teaching had made that very clear. The right sentence, at the right moment, can open a door or close one forever. The conversation happened on a Wednesday evening after dinner. Sandra had made pasta, which I appreciated, and we had eaten together at the kitchen table with a civility that felt, to me, increasingly hollow. When Derek pushed back his chair and reached for his phone, I set down my fork and I looked at my daughter. I need to talk to you both about something, I said. Sandra's eyes moved to Derek's before they moved to mine. That small movement told me everything. Derek put his phone face down on the table. Sure, he said. What's up? I had practiced this. Not a script, exactly, but a shape. I knew where I wanted to begin and where I wanted to end. And I knew which things needed to be said plainly and which things could be said gently. I want to talk about this house, I said. Sandra picked up her tea mug. The gesture was too casual. She had been expecting something. I know you've been looking into selling it, I said. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ordinary kind. It was the silence of people caught mid-calculation. Derek recovered first. He had more practice managing uncomfortable situations professionally. We've just been doing research, he said, exploring options. You've been in contact with a real estate agent, I said. You gave her this address. You discussed timing. Sandra's face went pale. Mom, you weren't supposed to. I set my hands flat on the table. I saw an email on your laptop. I wasn't looking for it, but I read it. Derek began to say something about privacy and misunderstandings and the fact that nothing had been finalized. He was good at that. Framing, reframing, finding the arrangement of words that made a thing sound less like what it was. But I had spent my career teaching young people to read beneath the surface of language, and I was not confused about what I had read. I let him finish. Then I said, calmly, I've spoken with my attorney. The reframing stopped. I've updated my will, I continued. I've also made certain that this house is properly protected against any transfers or claims I haven't personally authorized. Judith has the documentation. If there's any question about ownership or my wishes regarding this property, she can answer those questions clearly. Sandra's voice came out smaller than I expected. Mom, we weren't trying to cut you out. I know what I saw in that email, Sandra. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Her eyes filled. And I felt the sharp, complicated pain of watching your child cry and knowing that the pain they're feeling is not entirely undeserved. Derek leaned back in his chair. He had the look now of a man recalculating. The plan had assumed my compliance. Without my compliance, it was simply nothing. You're being extreme, he said. His voice had an edge under the reason. No, I said. He tried another angle. The house is an asset, Dorothy. It makes financial sense to think about these things. You can't live here forever. That's just a practical truth. I looked at him for a long moment. You're right that I won't live here forever, I said. But I will live here for as long as I choose to. And when I'm done with this house, I will decide what becomes of it. Not you. Not the real estate agent whose name I don't know. Me. Sandra was crying quietly now. Not loudly, but steadily, the way she used to cry as a child when she knew she had done something she couldn't take back. Derek stood up from the table. I think we all need to cool down. I am perfectly cool, I said. Please sit down. He didn't sit down, but he didn't leave the room either. He stood near the door with his arms crossed, and I watched him recalculate again. He was good at reading which battles were worth having. I hoped he was reading this one accurately. I turned to my daughter. Sandra, I said, look at me. She lifted her eyes. I need you to understand something, I told her. I have loved you completely since before you were born. I have given you everything I knew how to give. When you came back here, I opened this house because I love you and because I believed it was what families do. I believed you were here because you wanted to be with me, not because of what being with me was worth. She shook her head. Mom, I do want to be with you. Then act like it, I said. Not as a statement of accusation, but as a plain, simple request. Act like a daughter, not like someone managing a transaction. She put her face in her hands. Derek spoke from near the door. His voice was tighter now. I don't think this is all Sandra's fault. I've been the one pushing on this. She was just going along. I looked at him. I know, I said. I know exactly who has been pushing. But she went along, and that matters. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear the maple tree in the front yard moving against the house. Raymond had planted that tree 30 years ago. It was taller than the roofline now. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said what I had been thinking about for days, the sentence that I hoped would land somewhere real. I'm not angry, I told them. I am clear, and I need you both to be clear too. If you want to live in this house, you live here as guests who are grateful and respectful. If that's not something you can do, then I think you should find your own place. Sandra looked up. Are you asking us to leave? I'm asking you to decide what kind of people you want to be, I said. Under my roof. The days that followed were uncomfortable in the way that honest things often are. Derek moved through the house with a quietness that might have been sulking or might have been reflection. It was hard to tell with him. Sandra was careful around me, too careful, like someone who had broken something and wasn't sure yet how many pieces there were. I went about my life. I made my tea in the morning. I tended my garden, even though it was November, and there was little left to tend. I went to book club on Thursday. I called Judith to confirm everything was properly filed. On Saturday, Sandra knocked on the door of the sewing room. She knocked, and she waited for me to answer before she came in. I was working on the quilt. I set it down. She sat on the small bench near the window. She looked tired. She looked I realized. The way Raymond used to look when he knew he had made a mistake and was gathering himself to admit it. "I've been talking to Derek," she said. "A lot this week." I waited. She looked at her hands. "We found an apartment near his office. 3-bedroom, so when we eventually have kids, there'll be room." She paused. "We're going to sign the lease next week." I felt something move in my chest. Not triumph, the other thing. The bittersweet thing that doesn't have a clean name. "Sandra," I said. "That's the right decision." She looked up. I considered the question carefully. "I'm hopeful," I said, "that things will be better between us once you're in your own space." She nodded. Her eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm genuinely sorry. Not just because you found out. Because of what we were planning. Because of what I let happen." I reached over and took her hand. "This is what I know about forgiveness. It isn't the same as forgetting. It isn't a switch you flip that makes everything as it was. It's more like a door you choose to leave open. You have to choose it repeatedly, not just once. You have to choose it even when you're tired and the hurt is still tender." "I know," I told her, "and I believe you." She leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she used to do when she was small. I sat still and let her. Outside the window, the maple tree held its bare branches against the gray sky. Raymond's tree. I thought about the email I had read. I thought about the word occupant. I thought about what it meant to be reduced to an obstacle in your own life by people who were supposed to love you. And then I thought about this moment, my daughter's head on my shoulder, the quilt in my lap, the room that smelled like cedar and old fabric and something that had survived. "People make mistakes when they're afraid," I said softly. "Derek is afraid about money. You're afraid about the future. Those fears are real, but they don't get to be solved on my back." She nodded against my shoulder. "When they leave," I said, "I want us to still be able to have a meal together. I want to know your children someday. I want the door to be open." She sat up and looked at me. "It will be," she said. "I promise." I told her I was going to hold her to that. Moving day came 2 weeks later. It was a cold Saturday, the kind where your breath shows and your fingers go numb if you forget your gloves. Derek and a friend he'd called carried the heavier boxes. Sandra organized, wrapped things carefully, labeled everything in the methodical way she'd always had. I helped where they asked me to, and stayed out of the way where they didn't. At one point, Derek set down a box in the hallway and stood there looking at the wall where a painting of Sandra's had hung for the last 2 years. He had taken it down carefully, wrapped it in paper. He looked at the rectangular shadow it had left on the wall. He glanced at me. "I'll touch that up for you before we go," he said. "The paint." I told him I appreciated that. I meant it. He got a brush from the closet and fixed the wall himself, quietly, without being asked twice. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. When the last load was in the car, Sandra came back inside alone. She walked through the house slowly, room by room, not looking for anything she'd forgotten, just walking. I watched from the hallway. She came back to me at the front door. She hugged me hard, the kind of hug that is more apology than greeting. "Come to dinner next Sunday," I told her. "Both of you." She pulled back and looked at me. "Really?" "Really," I said. "But at my table. My pantry." She smiled, for the first time in 2 weeks. Her smile looked like her father's. It always had. After they drove away, I stood in the doorway for a while, listening to the neighborhood settle around me. Someone down the street was raking leaves. A dog barked twice and went quiet. The maple tree stood exactly where it had always stood. I went inside. I walked through each room the way you do after a long time away from yourself. The sewing room, where Raymond's chair sat empty and waiting, and entirely mine. The kitchen, where I had stood at that window for 3 decades. The bedroom, where I intended to sleep without listening for other people's footsteps. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea. I took it to the back porch and I sat in the cold with a blanket over my knees and I looked at the garden. The beds were bare for winter, but I knew exactly what I would plant in spring. I always knew. Raymond used to say that a home is not the walls, it's the intention of the person inside them. I had thought about that sentence a great deal over the past weeks. About what it means to intend to be somewhere, to choose your own life, and mean it. I had not been pushed out. I had not been managed or dissolved or relocated to a place with a dining hall and a shuttle to the pharmacy. I had stood in my own kitchen, and I had said the things I should have said sooner, and I had protected what was mine. I was not without grief. I want to be honest about that too. There was still the ache of knowing what my daughter had been willing to plan. There was still the understanding that something between us had been tested and found wanting, and that the rebuilding would take longer than a single honest conversation. But underneath the ache, something steadier. The particular quiet of a house that remembers you. The particular dignity of a woman who has finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. I pulled the blanket tighter and sipped my tea. The sky was going pink along the horizon, cold, clear, and entirely mine. If you have ever been made to feel like an inconvenience in the space you built with your own hands, I want you to hear this. You are not the problem to be solved. You are the woman who built the thing worth having, and it is not too late to say so. It is never too late to draw the line, even if your voice shakes when you draw it. The cold was settling in now, the real cold, the kind that sends you inside. I finished my tea, gathered my blanket, and stood up from the chair Raymond built. Its joints creaked, familiar as my own bones. I went inside and closed the door behind me.